What's up guys, how you doing? It's Sam from Gemini, and today we're going to be talking about England's contribution to martial arts. Booyah! As always, hope you're doing well and you're enjoying the nice rainy weather we've recently been having. Great, now we've got that out of the way, let's get into the video. So when you say England, you wouldn't necessarily think of England as a country which is rich in martial arts. I mean, I've done a video about this before. It's called Martial Arts Not Just From Asia, or words to that effect. Check that video out. Here's a link now if you haven't done so already. Hey guys, what's going on? It is Sam from the Gemini team, and we're going to talk today about there being no Eastern solution to martial arts. Interesting. Booyah! You've checked that out. Great. So, already been established, martial arts are not just from Asia. Pretty much any country has its own martial art or version of martial arts. They could be cultural as well, so different, not necessarily countries, but different cultures have specific emphasis on different martial arts, what have you. So it was a friend of mine, actually, who's been a subscriber since almost day one. He left a comment on one of my videos recently, and he just brought it up himself. He was like, you know, he has a thing for English martial arts. And this comment automatically got my attention because, like I said, you don't particularly associate England as a martial arts country. So that really got me thinking, and I responded to this guy in relation to what he was talking about. I knew what he was talking about. He was referring to Bartitsu, but that got me thinking about what kind of contribution has England, and when I say England, I'm referring to England. I'm not referring to like the wider island of Britain or Great Britain as a nation. I'm referring to England specifically. So before the union of England and Scotland took place, and before Wales got annexed by England and was, to all intents and purposes, became part of England. So specifically focusing on England, I was thinking, okay, so what kind of contribution has England made to martial arts? And the more I thought about this, the more I realised actually that England has made a huge contribution to martial arts, which has been completely overlooked by a huge portion of people, martial arts enthusiasts. And personally, my preferred and favourite English martial art is the longbow. Now, the longbow is a very specific weapon. The longbow is a very specific weapon, and it is a type of archery. So why am I not saying archery as an English martial art? Because archery has been around for centuries, and it was used by various different civilizations. It was used by ancient Egyptians. It was used by pre-Islamic Persian empires, Parthian dynasty from Persia, Mesopotamia, I believe, used a type of archery, and even countries like China and Korea, they were using archery, but it wasn't a longbow that they used. A lot of time they used like shorter bows. Recurve bows is the common name for them. So it wasn't necessarily longbow. They were using their own types of archery. And archery, again, it's been around for centuries, as we said, used in different cultures, used for both hunting, for food, but also used for warfare too. The English longbow. Why is it significant? Back in the 13th century, King Edward I invaded Wales. And during his conquest of Wales, I'm going to give a very Reader's Digest version of this because it's very long. But during his campaigns in Wales, his troops came under attack by Welsh infantry, Welsh townspeople. But a weapon became quite noticeable amongst the Welsh, and that was bow and arrow. And again, it wasn't a longbow. It was a shorter version of what could be considered a longbow. It was a bow and arrow, but it wasn't a longbow. However, the use of the Welsh archers, it was significant enough to harass the English armies invading Wales, but it wasn't enough to actually defeat them outright, because after 2 campaigns in Wales, Wales became subjected to England. It became incorporated into England. King Edward encouraged English settlers to go into Wales and settle. He introduced English laws. So whilst the archers of Wales harassed the English, they didn't cause significant damage. But point being, the lessons that King Edward learned from these Welsh archers, he then adapted and took forward. And he then took archers to Scotland, Welsh archers to Scotland. I believe they made about 40% of King Edward's army at the Battle of Falkirk. So he saw the significance of archers. But it wasn't until King Edward III, much later in the 14th century, actually started to really see archery as a method that he could actually use to employ on the battlefield to good effect. And King Edward actually did a campaign. He basically said that every able-bodied person in England who's able to, and again he said England specifically, was to go and train archery on like Sundays and whenever they had time off. Instead of going to the taverns and getting drunk, you were expected to go to your local shooting range and start practicing with bows and arrows. Gradually over time, the short bows that were used by the Welsh, the English began to adapt, and they made these bows much longer, and they became eventually longbows, hence the name. However, the word longbow wasn't actually used in the Middle Ages. They were called war bows. But point being, they were long, they were huge, and some of these bows were almost like 6 feet tall, and I'm about 6 foot myself, so that's a massive bow to have. And King Edward III, he drilled peasants, and he focused on getting peasantry to practice the longbow. It wasn't a higher class society weapon. The higher classes still used their cavalry, but the peasantry, the infantry, were expected to be practicing with the longbow. King Edward then, he invaded Scotland as part of the larger Scottish Wars of Independence, and he put his archers to good effect at the Battle of Halidon Hill, 1333. And he defeated the Scottish army, and basically, long story short, proved the supremacy of the firepower of the longbow. Later on, King Edward then invaded France as part of the 100 Years' War, and he took a huge amount of English archers over to France. Now, when I say English archers, I specifically do mean English archers. Most archers used in the 100 Years' War were employed from the counties of Lancashire and the counties of Cheshire, both in the north of England. A small minority did come from Wales, but they were the exception, they weren't the rule. There seems to be a very common misnomer for some historians who would look at the longbow and say, oh, it was like the Welsh were the most versed in the longbow. It's a myth. No. The best longbowmen came from Cheshire and Lancashire. I think as well Yorkshire had a very sizable longbow presence as well. So it was the northern counties of England. How the Welsh myth gets involved in this is largely thanks to Shakespeare. One of his plays, I can't cite it off the top of my head, but I'll include a reference to it. It cited something like there was a man from Monmouth who was very good with bow and arrow, and he helped King Henry V or something to that effect. And I think a lot of historians kind of took that as a gospel fact that actually a lot of the Welsh were the best at the longbow, and whenever English kings went over to France to invade, they'll take scores and scores of Welsh longbowmen. Realistically, yes, there were some Welsh who did go to France to serve in English armies with the longbow, but the fact remains most of them, the vast majority, on all the campaigns in France, whether it was Edward III's or Henry V's, were English, from Lancashire, from Cheshire. As a matter of fact, when Henry V invaded France in 1415, he only recruited a very small minority of Welsh longbowmen from the south of Wales, because the North Welsh, their loyalty was suspect. There'd been a revolution or a rebellion actually in the early part of the 15th century, which actually made King Henry V and Parliament look at the Welsh very suspiciously and say, we don't want to have a huge army of Welshmen who could very well turn around and just mutiny against us. So their loyalty was suspect. So Henry V actually took very few Welsh people to France, and subsequently the Battle of Agincourt. It was very much, for the most part, an English victory over the French. However, let's go back to the contribution of the longbow. So King Edward III invaded France, and it was in 1337 the English army met the French army at what's called Crecy. And what happened there was the French were vastly outnumbering the English. The French, who had a reputation for being very chivalrous and brave on the battlefield, they wanted to have honour and glory on the battlefield. So they mounted their stallions, dressed up in their armour, charged across the field towards the English. English peasantry knocked their longbow strings on, pulled out the arrows that they'd had stuck into the ground. Reason being they stuck the arrows into the ground is because think of the soil. It's going to have loads of dirt and germs and God knows what else in the soil. So if you got shot by one of those arrows, even if the arrow itself didn't kill you, the fact you're going to get an infection from all this disease and stuff which is being on the arrowhead, you'll probably die from infection later on. So medieval warfare was actually quite biological and scientific. It's not as pugilistic as what people say. There was a bit of a science to it. However, French came across the field, English knocked their longbows, fired scores and scores and scores of arrows into this French nobility and basically decimated them. This was the first time that the longbow had been used on mainland European soil. The French were mostly used to using crossbows. Indeed, crossbows have been around in Europe and England for like hundreds and hundreds of years. Thing is, with a crossbow, the basic difference between crossbow and a longbow, crossbow was generally more accurate, but it was shorter. And the crossbows which the French employed at Crecy, mostly it was Genoese from Genoa, who were the crossbowmen on the French army. The crossbows were heavy, they were awkward, and it took a long time to reload. So they could fire a bolt, but they'd had to reload, and it was a very complex mechanism they had to use to reload a crossbow bolt. And by the time they had done this, they'd already been hit by probably about 3 waves of English arrows. So first time, Battle of Crecy, first time that the longbow had been used on mainland European soil by peasants, and it completely destroyed French nobility army. And that was the start of a revolution of warfare as we know it. Why? Because it was the first time that projectile weapons fired by peasantry had won over the modus operandi of the time, which was only nobles can fight, only nobles can win battles. You have to be on a horse, heavily armoured, to win a fight. Crecy changed all that. Subsequently, the lessons of Crecy were learned by both sides in different ways. The English learnt that, yes, this longbow can prove to be effective. When fired en masse, you've got thousands of arrows, basically raining arrows basically on top of you. There's no protection from that. It was often described as a raining death, basically. The French came to fear the longbow and hate it. The English began to glorify in the longbow, and subsequently, whenever English armies went over to France, they would generally take smaller armies, but it would be almost completely composed of longbowmen. Now, the longbow itself was a skill. It took years to be able to master a longbow and to be able to use it to good effect. Much like any martial art, it takes years of practice to be able to kind of become competent at something. Same with a longbow, you can just pick up the bow and fire it. This bow being 6 foot tall and almost a straight line, there was a skill to be able to actually put the strings on. And if you kept the strings on for too long, the bow would start to warp, and then thus, if it warps, it loses power. But what kind of wood was used? It was yew from a yew tree. Now, the French didn't know this, so when the French tried replicating the longbow, they were using all different types of wood, oak, pine, whatever, and they either wouldn't bend, so the arrow wouldn't shoot, or they just snap, because they were weak. The wood was weak, not the French people. To be able to actually draw the string right back to the ear as well of the archers, that took a huge amount of strain, and there's records of English archers having like their right shoulder hunched up a lot more than their left, because they were deformed, because they were practicing so much all the time that their muscles became deformed. What was the arrow made out of? Different arrowheads, bodkins, broadheads. What were the flights of the arrows made out of? The French didn't know this, and it was from geese. It was white geese that gave the flights. Crossbow bolts, by comparison, their flights were leather, which added to the heaviness, which made the bolts not go as far as an arrow, which could shoot much further. Point being, subsequent campaigns, as I said, when the English then went over to France for the next 100-odd years, The Hundred Years' War actually went on for longer than 100 years, and it was actually a series of campaigns as opposed to one long, prolonged conflict. Different stages as well. But the English would generally take smaller armies, made mostly of longbowmen from Cheshire, Lancashire, some Yorkshire, very small Welsh presence. As a matter of fact, at Agincourt, actually, there was more Welsh archers on the French side than there were on the English. But it revolutionised warfare because it was the start of projectile weaponry. And of course, from the longbow, the 100 Years' War actually ended with a French victory, the Battle of Castellon, with gunpowder. The French had learnt the lessons of the archers. They then wanted to take it a step further. And when France began gaining ground towards the end of the 100 Years' War, England was losing its possessions. They'd lost all the regions they'd captured. Normandy, they'd lost Aquitaine, or Gascony as it's called. The only region that England had left by the end of the 100 Years' War was Calais. But a lot of these reversals came around because the French then began employing and using gunpowder, an early version of gunpowder, which is again cannon, very early handguns, which probably did more harm to the shooter than who they're shooting, but it was all projectile. So the archers, the longbow, English longbow, started the revolution of projectile weaponry to good effect. By the time the 100 Years' War ended, the Battle of Castellon, it was French cannon against the English commander, John Talbot, who had a small portion of English archers. The French won that very decisively, completely slaughtered the English army, which basically ended the 100 Years' War. But then, end of 100 Years' War, then in England, we went into the Tudor period, which is the start of the English Renaissance. Longbows were beginning to lose their effect and be replaced by very basic firearms, very basic muskets, like, flintlock. Well, flintlocks came a bit later on, but they went from very basic gunpowder muskets to a bit more advanced gunpowder muskets, flintlocks. Then that adapted into rifles, which adapted into machine guns, and so on and so forth. But it was the English longbow at the Battle of Crecy which actually started the end of feudal chivalry combat as we knew it, and started projectile weaponry. And of course, it was not, as I said, it wasn't used by nobility, it was used by common people as well, which went to show as well that it wasn't just the nobles who could be soldiers. A common peasant could be tilling his field one season, next season he'd be killing nobles with his longbow. So England's contribution to the world of martial arts, English longbow, which then went on to influence projectile weaponry, and to this day we're still using projectiles over hand-to-hand combat. Indeed, when I was in the TA, I remember actually asking my sergeant, can I learn some hand-to-hand combat whilst I'm in the TA? And he said, why do you need to learn that? It's like, you've got a rifle, projectile weaponry. So guys, just a quick video about England's contribution to world martial arts. Hope you enjoyed this. I love history, so any questions you have relating to history, any aspect of medieval history, specifically 100 Years' War, that's my speciality, please feel free to leave a comment down below, ask me questions about it, and I'll do my best to answer. I'm Sam from Gemini. Stay safe, train hard, keep listening to Winter Sun because they're the best band around, and I'll see you all in the next video. Booyah!